Thank you for the invite here, Rob. I appreciate it. And I like talking about a bunch of different stuff in AA history, and this is one of my more favorite and more complicated topics. So we'll see how long it takes me to run through all of these slides here today. But I want to talk about challenging the six-step story that Bill Wilson told. And the most challenging chapter that I had to write for my book was chapter number 23, Writing the 12 Steps. Uh, could there be a more important story in AA history than the one explaining the source of the 12 steps and how they came to be written? Could there possibly be a more important story? But now this should have been really, really, really easy. I mean, after all, Bill told that wonderful story about the day he wrote the 12 steps over and over and over again. But I got to tell you, it just wasn't easy. It took me more than 6 months to untangle all the contradictions and problems that I just kept stumbling over in that lovely story that Bill told. Now, I've shown repeatedly in my book and explained in many of these presentations that Bill Wilson he was not an accurate historian. He was a great storyteller, but he wasn't an accurate historian. But those stories that he told were all too frequently parables and mythical versions of what really happened. And the historian's job is to get down to as close as possible what really happened. Now, Bill wasn't even trying to be historically accurate in those stories. That wasn't his purpose at all. All he was concerned with was getting people sober, and the details that I'm so invested in, just weren't important to him. What was important to Bill Wilson was the impact that the stories and the message of the story might have on the suffering alcoholic. That's what he was working on. So we can hardly fault him if the historical record contradicts him as frequently as it does, and I've learned that it's pretty frequent that it does that. But Bill's historical inaccuracy has been widely noted and acknowledged by all scholarly historians. I'm not just breaking news to you here. If you've been reading these kind of books, you should know this. And even the conference-approved literature of Alcoholics Anonymous Pass It On notes that Bill was never reluctant to stretch a fact for the sake of emphasis. And on the same page, he says, Bill often spoke in, quote, metaphor rather than relating events as they actually happened. And he was never likely to pass up the opportunity to deliver a parable where he thought it would do some good. So whenever we look at this, doesn't mean everything Bill Wilson said wasn't accurate. There was a bunch of stuff that he said that was historically accurate. But sorting out the things that weren't quite so accurate or were wildly inaccurate can be a real challenge for somebody who's trying to get closer to what really happened. And then there's this other element that turns up so regularly in many of the problematic stories that I stumbled across with Bill Wilson, and that was Bill was really well aware of his own ego problem. I mean, this is the guy who thought at one time he was going to call it not Alcoholics Anonymous, but the BW movement, you know? So he was really aware of his own ego problems, and he constantly told stories that took the spotlight off himself. And he gave credit to other people for things that he was solely responsible for over and over and over again. All you got to think about is, for instance, all those people that he christened as co-founders throughout his life. Both of these tendencies, eliminating the messy details to sharply clarify the message, and let's take the focus off of me, folks, play a very large part in the story Bill told throughout the last 21 years of his life about how he came to write the 12 steps. Lois said that Bill wrote the 12 steps on the first week of December 1938. First week of December 1938. And this date fits really, really well with all the other contemporary evidence we have for when each chapter of the big book was written. So that's a solid thing. December 1938, first week. This means that the steps weren't written until just 4 months before the big book was published. 4 months. They weren't put down on paper until 4 months. And the chapter 5 and 6 were the last two chapters written, because you can't write chapters 5 or 6 until you know what the steps are, because all they're doing is expounding on the steps from 3 to 11. In Bill's version of the story, he said that he had realized that what he had already written was just much too loose. There was just too much loose. And it was so loose that he worried that the drunks were going to just wiggle out of it. He literally said that a couple of times. They're just going to wiggle out of it. So, and that was certainly true, because before the 12 steps were written, the instructions, quote unquote, the instructions on, quote, how to get sober were only very loosely described in there is a solution, which presents Bill's solution, Bill's diagnosis of the problem that you're a real alcoholic. You have no mental defense against the first drink. But what you can do is get yourself a spiritual awakening that's going to stand between you and the first drink. And then more about alcoholism, which talks about the insanity of picking up the first drink. And We Agnostics, which talks about getting yourself a spiritual experience to stand between you and the first drink. And Working with Others, which basically says when those other two things fail, go work with another alcoholic that's going to keep you sober. So those were the basic instructions, loose though they may be, that Bill had already written into the book in those 4 different chapters. And indeed, plenty of room there for sneaky alcoholics to just wiggle out. No doubt about it. Obviously, something far more solid, far more specific, and far more concrete was definitely needed here. And Bill claims that this worried him so much that it brought on one of his imaginary ulcers. This is one of the things he talks about in his diary and Lois's diary. Bill's having another imaginary ulcer. Anytime he got worried about something, it would go right to his stomach, and he'd take to his bed and go see his brother-in-law doctor for help. So anyhow, he was so upset by this that he went upstairs and he lay down on the bed. And according to Bill, he picked up a yellow legal pad, and he says that he started out with those original 6 steps, and then he just broke those originals down into more specific actions. And when he counted them up, he realized that he created these new 12 steps. Whoa! Note that this is where the famous 6-step story first enters the picture, a story that Bill told repeatedly during the last 21 years of his life. So what was my problem with this? I'm trying to write this chapter on Bill writing this law. So what's my problem? Well, actually, there are 3 major problems, and all of them are related to this very problematic 6-step story. I'm trying to write about what really happened, and I'm just looking for verification on things Bill Wilson said. And I'm stumbling over problems day after day after day, week after week, having real chasing things around. So the first major problem was the 6 steps that Bill mentioned. They just don't break down into the 12 steps. We'll see that in a minute. That was a big stretch. Second problem was I could find absolutely no evidence from 1935 to 1939 of there ever being anything even remotely like an original 6-step program of recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous. And third, if the 12 steps didn't come from the 6 steps, then where did they come from? So first of all, I needed to explore Bill's claim that the 12 steps were just the result of him breaking down those original 6 steps. And this was interesting on a couple of different levels. So we can go through this in 2 different ways. First of all, there are a few things in the original 6 steps that do not appear in the original 12 steps. Now, when I say the original 12 steps, I'm talking about them as they appeared in the pre-publication multilith copy in mid-February 1939, several weeks before the book was published in April of 1939. And so I've underlined and highlighted the things that do not appear in those original 12 steps. The original 12 steps in the multilith copy didn't say "we," for instance, as the first word of number 1 step. That wasn't in there. That was put in at the last minute before the book was published. And we admitted that we were licked. We were licked isn't in the steps at all. And there's the "we" again. And defects or sins. We're getting into sins here, folks. That's not in the 12 steps. Thank you very much, Bill Wilson. We confessed, and we did it in confidence. Those things are not in the 12 steps. The "we" again, and we were people we had harmed by our drinking. He doesn't really get into that kind of specificity when he does the 12 steps. And he says, we're going to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward in money or prestige. That again is not shown anywhere in the 12 steps. And the "we" in step number 6 again. So, but even more interesting and important is the fact that there are an amazing number of things in the original version of the 12 steps that are nowhere to be found in Bill's supposed 6 steps. You're just breaking them down. Bill? You're breaking them down, those 6 things we just went through, and you come up with, admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Yeah, that our lives had become unmanageable is not in the 6 steps. So what I've done here is I've underlined the stuff that I did see in the original quote unquote 6 steps, and I've highlighted things that are not in the original 6 steps. The entire 2nd step is not in the original 6 steps. Most of the 3rd step is not in the entire in the 6 steps. Making a searching and fearless is not in it, and in the 6 steps you just admitted to one person. Now he's got God and ourselves and the exact nature of our wrongs. Step 6 is not anywhere noted or even hinted at in the 6 steps, as is set humbly on our knees. I love that the original versions of that was humbly on our knees, holding back nothing. They changed that before the book was published. But this again is the original that he supposedly got from the Six Steps. And then made a list. We became willing to make amends to them all, not in the Six Steps. And whenever possible, when injure them or others, not in the steps. Continued to take personal inventory. The 10th step isn't anywhere in the Six Steps. And most of the 11th step is not in the Six Steps. And most of the 12th step is not in the Six Steps. All that highlighted stuff in yellow, clearly those original 12 steps offer instructions that they go far beyond and are tremendously more specific than anything anything you can find in Bill's 6-step program. An awful lot of new things have been added there. All that yellow type that we just looked at. So I just naturally had to ask, where did all that new material come from, if not from the 6 steps? And it was a boatload of new material. And that's an excellent question, but we're going to have to deal with that a little bit later. So I want to move on to the second problem. The second problem was that once I started looking for verified sources of that story, of there originally being 6 steps in Alcoholics Anonymous in the Flying Blind period, the 1934 to 1939 period, there was no evidence, absolutely no evidence to be found in not in any of the contemporary documents of there being a 6-step program prior to the creation of the 12 steps. And we're going to go through a bunch of that stuff because a lot of people don't believe that when I say that stuff. So in fact, the first record, I think this is shocking. I was shocked by it when I discovered it. The first record I can find of Bill Wilson ever telling the 6-step story was May 23rd, 1949, more than 10 full years after he wrote the steps. More than 10 full years, the first time he tells his 6-step story. Now, I've been asking people for 15 years, other AA researchers, can you please find an earlier source for this 6-step story? I would love to find an earlier source for it, but so far, nobody's come up with a source for that. Worse yet than telling the story 10 years for the first time afterwards, making this thing up and drop it into the conversation. The first time he told that story to those psychiatrists at the psychiatric convention in Montreal in May of 1949, he said that in that speech, he said Ebby had offered him the fully realized 6-step program to him during their initial kitchen table meeting in November of 1934. Ebby just hand-delivered those to him, is what he told them. But in every other times, he told the story over and over again, all the other later talks and writings, he told a much different story. He always claimed in those later stories, he abandoned the Ebby gave it to me story, and he came up with this, the 6 steps were something that gradually evolved within the fellowship during its earliest years. And again, in all of the primary documents from AA's earliest years, there is absolutely no evidence supporting Bill's claim of a quote unquote pretty consistent procedure, as he calls it in AA Comes of Age, his 6-step program, before the 12 steps were written. Now, it's a historian's rule that absence of evidence is evidence of absence, which is a cool thing. You know, just because you can't find evidence saying that this happened doesn't mean it didn't happen. But the fact of the matter is there's a ton of evidence about what did happen, and none of it mentions the 6-step story. So in this case, there's such a huge amount of contrary evidence that I consider it that stuff positively destroys any possibility that Bill's 6-step story is even remotely true. If there had been a pretty consistent procedure, quote unquote, of a quote unquote 6-step program around as early as 1934, when Ebby handed it to him on a golden platter, or if such a 6-step program had evolved over time as more and more people got sober, then you could reasonably expect to find mention of those 6 steps in the primary documents and writings published in 1938 and 1939, the time that they were getting the big book together. And there's a lot of those documents, people. February 1938, Frank Amos goes out to Akron and he writes a report on how he's working out in Akron. And in May 1938, Fitz Mayo writes the first version of his story. We're going to see all of these things individually. June 1938, Bill Wilson writes the first version of There Is a Solution. June 1938, Hank writes his ideas for what should and shouldn't go in the book. And then later that month, he creates an outline for the book. Hank Barkus creates an outline for the book. And then in November of 38, he writes his proposed Q&A chapter for the book, which is one of the more fascinating little discoveries I made in the archive. 1938 to 1939, many letters written by AA people about what's going on in the program. and But most decisively, in terms of there being no evidence, the 30 personal stories that appear in the back of the first edition of the big book, all of which were written between October of 1938 and March of 39, 6-month period, no evidence of a six-step story. None of which have any mention of Bill Wilson's six-step program. So to begin with, Bill regularly changed the wording of the alleged six steps, but here once again are the version of them that he offered in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age in 1957. We got to review these quickly. We already did it, but we got to go through it a little quickly because we're going to be like looking for these things in all those other sources. We admitted we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. We made a moral inventory of our defects or sins. We confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. We made restitution to all those we had harmed by our drinking. We tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward in money or prestige. And we prayed to whatever God we thought there was for power to practice these precepts. So that's his pretty consistent procedure. Again, there's a lot of versions about this that he wrote up over the years. So let's look at some of those contemporary documents and see how often they mention anything that even vaguely, remotely remembers those six steps. February 38, Frank Amos visits Akron to see what the Akron folks are doing to stay sober. And he writes a long report for John D. Rockefeller when he gets back. In his report, he describes the 7 things, they're actually listed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that people were doing to stay sober in Ohio. The new man must realize that he can never drink again. He must surrender absolutely to God. He must, like the must here, must remove all sin from his life. Must have daily quiet time. That's what the Oxford group people called meditation, quiet time. Must help other alcoholics, important but not vital to meet with other alcoholics, and important but not vital to go to church. So those are the 7 things Frank Amos sees active going out there. But how many of those line up with Bill's 6 steps? Maybe 2. Must realize that he can never drink again. It corresponds, I would say, to Bill's number 1. We admitted we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. But there's nothing in Bill's steps about surrendering absolutely to God or removing sin, all sin from your life, or having a daily meditation practice. And the second one of the 2 is must help other alcoholics, which was Bill's number 5. We tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward or prestige. Whereas important but not vital to meet with alcoholics and important not vital to go to church make no mention in the 12 steps, in the 6 steps. So clearly, they're not working any kind of 6-step program in Akron in February of 1938. This is an on-the-ground, third-person, non-alcoholic report about what's going on out there. Late May 1938, at the same time as Bill's writing his story, Fitz Mayo, AA number 3 in New York, was also writing a first version of his personal story. Bill's writing his story and Fitz is doing the same on the side. But the path of recovery that Fitz describes in his first version of the story is radically different from Bill Wilson's 6 steps. In Fitz Mayo's story, it's currently called Our Southern Friend. That story appears in all 4 editions of the big book. And the only 2 people that have all their story in all editions of the big book are Dr. Bob and Archie Trowbridge and Fitz Mayo, just those 3. But he called his original version of the story Me and John, John being John Barleycorn, Me and John Barleycorn. So late in May 1938, from Fitz's original type version, one evening, he's in Towns Hospital. One evening, I was playing bridge in my room with 2 other alcoholics and a drug addict. Now, I highlighted that because the drug addict's going to disappear when we get closer to the official version. Anything to keep from thinking of the blank future. When the game was over, the men left the room, but one returned. He looked at me and said, you think you're hopeless, don't you? And Fitz said, certainly. I replied, I know it. Well, you are not, he said. There are men on the streets of New York today who are worse than you are, and they don't drink anymore. Then the man asked, would you be willing to live on a new basis? So here comes the solution. Try to live up to ideals by trying to be absolutely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving in all your relationships with your fellow man to get rid of this drink problem? Of course I would, he says. I declared without much thought I'd do anything. And the guy says, then all your troubles are over. and he left the room. Now, folks, those recommended four absolutes are just pure Oxford group teaching. You can't get more Oxford group. You cannot get more Oxford group than the four absolutes, which is exactly what Fitz and all the other members of early AA were doing in the Stay Sober in late 1935, and quite frankly, for many years still to come. We always have to remember that AA grew out of the Oxford group. And while neither the alleged 6 steps nor the 12 steps are they're not directly traceable back to the Oxford group, the influence of their general spiritual practices can be seen repeatedly in AA's quote unquote suggested program of recovery. They're right there in plain sight. It was, after all, exactly those Oxford Group general principles in one form or another that AA's early members were working in the hope of getting sober and then staying that way. That's what they were doing. They were doing the best they could with that stuff. Bill Wilson said at one point they quickly in New York had to get rid of the absolutes because the drunks just couldn't stand the absolutes, But so they weren't doing everything that the Oxford Group was doing. But that's most of the stuff if they got something out of the Oxford Group that worked for them, they kept doing that. That was their modus operandi. Ah, at this time in the early years, the Flying Blanket, it's really an Oxford Group program of recovery they're following rather than any of this 6-step program that Bill later made up. So now here we are, February 1939. This is Fitz's multi-lift when it shows up in the multi-lift 8-9 months later. That's 8 months after the original version, and it's 2 months after his best friend Bill Wilson has written the 12 steps. And he says 4 alcoholics. See, we lost the drug addict. I love the fact that we just edited the drug addict right out. 4 alcoholics play bridge in a smoke-filled room. The game is over, and the other 3 leave. One man comes back, closing the door behind him. He looks at me. He says, "You think you're hopeless, don't you?" And I said, "I know it." Well, you're not," says the man. "There are men in the streets of New York today who are worse than you and don't drink anymore." Then he asked me if I believe in a power greater than myself, whether I call that power God, Allah, Confucius, prime cause, divine mind, or any other name. Then he asked me if I'm willing to right all the wrongs I have ever done to anyone, no matter how wrong I thought they were. Am I willing to be honest with myself about myself and tell someone about myself? And am I willing to think of other people instead of myself and of their needs to get rid of my drink problem? "I'll do anything," I reply. This is the greatly revised story, but we still have Mies Riddle do anything. "Then all your troubles are over," said the man, and he leaves the room. Now, Fitz's original story told the truth about recovery in early AA, that it was all about the Oxford group. But by his time, his story appears in the multi-lift printing 2 months after the 12 steps have now been written. The Oxford group is eliminated, and actions from the 12 steps make an appearance in their place. No more absolutes. Now we've got these things that fit right into the 12 steps. This is an absolutely perfect example of what we will see in a few minutes in Earl Treat's later big book story. And quite frankly, a number of times within AA history, this stuff shows up. We regularly change our stories about the past so that they better reflect the present reality. There's recordings of Ebby saying, well, the things we were doing in 1936 were just the same as the AA meetings are today. And it's like, there's no way that's possible. I mean, we have blank, he said that in the 50s, but I mean, we got stuff from the 30s that says that's not true at all. But we always want to tell stories that fit with the present reality, and we morph the past so that it does that. So we do that rather than accurately tell what really happened. And there's a professional term for this. William James calls it the false memory thing. False memory. And he says all human beings do it. It's not just drunks who do it. We all do it. Then in early of June of 1938, Wilson wrote, "There is a solution." And so here's this chapter presents his brilliant diagnosis of the real alcoholic's problem, that you have no mental defense against the first drink. I think that's Bill Wilson's moment of genius, and his promised solution: you need to get yourself a vital spiritual experience that stand between you and the first drink. Both of those things are perfectly, and that's just what this chapter is all about. It's those two things right there. Was there any this is a chapter called "There is a Solution," right? There is a solution. Was there any mention or even allusion to the 6-step program, Bill's chapter proclaiming the solution to alcoholism? There is a solution, but we don't mention the 6 steps. Not a word. Also, the same first week of June 1938, Hank Parkhurst wrote an 11-page document in which what Bill wrote his ideas, Hank's ideas, of what should and should not go into the chapter that Bill was just then writing. There is a solution. So his critique of what was going into There Is a Solution. Did Hank make any complaints in his 11 pages of ideas that Bill had somehow just forgotten to mention the six-step solution in that chapter called There Is a Solution? Not a word. Then in the third week of June 1938, Hank Parkhurst wrote a detailed outline for all the different chapters to be written for the big book. And really, this is just an amazingly prophetic document, accurate document. If you see that, I talk about that at length in my book. Did any of those proposed chapters in Hank's outline make any mention or even allusion to a six-step program? No, no six steps or anything resembling them to be found in the 11 pages. I mean, the 25 chapters. In November 1938, Hank Parkhurst wrote his proposed Q&A chapter for the big book, which of course never appeared in the book, but it's one of the more fascinating discoveries I made when I was in the archive in New York City. And that archive typescript is 15 pages long, and it presents one man's, Hank Parkhurst, account of how the program of recovery was then working in New York City as he saw it. Questions and answers, questions and answers, questions and answers. Is there any mention or even an allusion to a six-step program to be found anywhere in those 15 pages? Nope, not a word. How about in any of the contemporary letters that explain what they were doing to get and then stay sober? Well, on July 22nd, 1938, 2 months after he's written Bill's story, Bill writes a letter to Dr. Esther Richardson. She's a psychiatrist down at Johns Hopkins. And he says, some of us felt as long as 3 years ago, there's a stretch, that out of old and well-known elements, we might compound a synthesis which would possess new and rather startling powers in this field. All right, that's little blousy prose from Bill Wilson, it doesn't really tell me much. Each of us, he said, had felt it imperative to place our kit of tools before other sufferers, work with other alcoholics. In the first years of recovery, we have discovered that it is almost mandatory for us to do this. We have to turn our interest outward towards others, lest we be overwhelmed by our own conflicts and difficulties, which would rise out of the past to tear us down. Certainly, there is the promise of something new and different there, but really little more than some general quote unquote spiritual principles with a heavy emphasis on moral psychology. Still, no mention of the six steps when he's talking to the woman down in Johns Hopkins. And this is great. This is February 11, 1939. Hank Parkhurst writes a letter to Jackie Williams. Jackie Williams is down in, he's a slipper and slider. He's down in Washington. And Hank writes to him, he says, look, when I first started out on this thing, Bill Wilson, for months, kept my nose to one thing. For months. Hank, where have you been selfish? Where have you hurt people? Where have you been wrong? I don't care how wrong the other person may have been, but where have you been wrong? Month after month, I went through this sort of thing, and only now is the light beginning to break, 1939, upon me. Only now am I beginning to tell myself the truth, and I wonder if that inward knowledge that Bill inspired, that actually I am selfish, and technically selfish, only thinking of myself, has not produced a long period of sobriety. Once again, no mention of any six steps of sobriety. We have plenty of talk about what Hank loves to talk about, moral psychology, which is basically getting your head out of your butt and paying attention to other people. Finally, there's an absolute wealth of testimony about how people got sober in the late 1930s, and they can be found in those 30 stories that appear in the back of the first edition of the Big Book. Now, amazingly, none of those 30 stories mention anything like Bill's six steps as their path to sobriety, except for story number 31. Bill's story, which we will see pretty soon, is a completely different story. I don't purposely mean to bore you. But most AAs have never read the stories in the back of the book in the first edition of the Big Book. So they're really skeptical when I say that, look, there's no evidence back there of the six-step program to be found there. People love the six-step program. They just love it. So please bear with me as we review each of those stories, looking for evidence of what our earliest members say they actually did to get and then stay sober. Doctor's nightmare. If you think you are an atheist, an agnostic, a skeptic, or have any other form of intellectual pride which keeps you from accepting what is in this book, I feel sorry for you. Your Heavenly Father will never let you down. European drinker, you've been trying man's way, and they always fail, he told me. You can't win unless you try God's way. That day, I gave my will to God and asked to be directed. Travel editor scholar. No conviction was necessary to establish my status as a miserable failure at managing my own life. I began to read the Bible daily and to go over a simple devotional exercise as a way to begin each day. Gradually, I began to understand. The backslider. All my life, he said, I had been doing things on my own human will as opposed to God's will, and that the only certain way for me to stop drinking was to submit my will to God and let him handle my difficulties. Home brewmeister, spiritually, I have found a friend who never lets me down and is ever eager to help. I can actually take my problems to him, and he does give me comfort, peace, and radiant happiness. For all of these blessings, I thank him. 7-month slip, I only know that as long as I seek God's help to the best of my ability, just so long will liquor never bother me. My wife and I, they were living proof that the sincere attempt to follow the cardinal teachings of Jesus Christ was keeping them sober. I acknowledged my fault to God and asked his help to keep on the course I had to follow. And a ward of the probate court, I learned the secret. They had a religious experience. I was willing and renewed my acquaintance with God and acknowledged him as a reality. I found it easy. I came to life and have been free now for 2 years. I hope never to take another drink. And here's Aces Full. This one was only in the multilith. It got pulled before it got to the big book. But if friends and fellowship were to disappear tomorrow, I don't think I would be dismayed. Back of all that, there is the knowledge that I have a divine Father, that as long as I try to walk as he has laid down for me to do throughout my life, nothing of ill can befall me, that if I wish, I can be sober for the rest of my life. And the fearful one is it was so simple. The sum and substance of it all seemed to be that if I would turn to God, that was very probably that he could do a better job of my life than I had. The salesman, they made it very plain that I had to seek God, that I had to state my case to him and ask for help. Every morning, I read a part of the Bible. I read a part of the Bible, and I ask God to carry me through the day safely. I've been sober for 2 years, kept that way by submitting my natural will to the higher power, and that is all there is to it. Trust me, truth freed me. Are you right with the Father who knows your needs before you ask? If so, your help comes from an ever-present and all-powerful Father. Close shave, I feel that the combined effort of these 3 Christian gentlemen made it possible for me to have a vital spiritual experience. And an alcoholic's wife writes, since giving my husband's problem to God, I have found peace and happiness. My husband and I now talk over our problems and trust in a divine power. We have now started to live. When we live with God, we want for nothing. The Rolling Stone, a religious awakening was conveyed to me through some unforeseen force. I have found a new life, and I know as long as I do the few things that God requires of me, I will never take another drink. And finally, I just love this. There's this great story called the Car Smasher, right? Why not avail myself of this all-wise, ever-present help? This I did. I ask for, accept, and acknowledge this help, and know that so long as I do, I shall never take a drink. And what is more important, though impossible without the first, all other phases of my life have been helped. There is, it seems to me, 4 steps to be taken in one who is a victim of alcoholism. First, have a real desire to quit. Second, admit you can't. This is the hardest. Third, ask for his ever-present help. And 5, accept and acknowledge this help. Now, there's nothing there that corresponds to Bill 6, really. And that is the sum total of the important testimony of how to get and stay sober to be found in 16 of the 18 Ohio stories written for the Big Book in 1938 and 1939. The 2 remaining Ackman stories make no mention of God's role in their sobriety, which the others are all emphasizing to a T. Writing the Rods emphasizes fellowship as the critical factor. And while Fired Again only notes that the alcoholics who visited him in the hospital, quote unquote, imparted to me the necessary knowledge and mental tools which have resulted in my complete sobriety, with no articulation of what they are. In short, nothing even remotely close to Bill's 6 steps was thought worthy of mention in any of the recovery stories from Ohio that were written during the Flying Blind period. We're looking for evidence here, people. The New Yorkers also make no mention of the supposed 6-step program in their 12 Big Book stories. This is Hank's story. I love this. He raised my hopes so high it looked as though he had something. I don't know. I guess I was so sold that I expected him to spring some kind of pill. And I asked him desperately what it was. And he said, God. And I laughed. And then 6 pages later, Hank says, Brr. This is the close of his story. This floor is cold on my knees. Why are the tears running down my cheeks? God, have mercy on my soul. Florence Rankin, a female victor in Feminine Victory. Are you willing to give up? Are you willing to say, here it is, God, all mixed up. I don't know how to unmix it. I'll leave it to you. And our Southern friend, Fitzmail, the thing I do is to say, God, here I am, and here are all my troubles. I've made a mess of things and can't do anything about it. You take me and all my troubles and do anything you want with me. A businessman's recovery. It has never occurred to me that he, in his infinite wisdom, knew much better than I what I should have and be and do. And then if I simply turn the decision over to him, it would be led along the right path. Smile with me at me. From that day, I gave and still give and always will time every day to read the word of God and let him do all the caring. Who am I to try to run myself or anyone else? Educated agnostic. We actually got mention of a couple of steps in here, but nothing. Anyhow, a belief in the basic spirituality of life has grown, and with it, belief in the supreme and guiding power of good. The first step I took when I admitted to myself for the first time that all my previous thinking might be wrong. And the second step came when I first consciously wished to believe. Another prodigal. Then the next day, a fine fellow came in a halting but effective way, told how he had placed himself in God's hand and keeping. Almost before I knew it, I was asking God to clean me up. On his way, I should not be surprised to find myself coming to the astounding conclusion that God, whoever or whatever he may be, is eminently more capable of running this universe than I am. At last, I believe I am on my way. And The Lone Endeavor, which was really written by Ruth Hawk, and it was pulled out of the second printing because the guy drank badly. But in the thing that Ruth Hawk wrote, based on conversations with this guy's mother and him, I knew that the only way to combat this curse was to ask for the help of that greater power, God. God is my only chance. And finally, these men were thinking straight, had given themselves, their minds, over to a higher power for direction. That day, I made my first effort in this direction, and an entire new world opened up for me. Drinking as a vicious habit was what was completely washed out of my consciousness. The two remaining New York stories make no mention of God, nor do they note any other factor that contributed to their sobriety. A different slant is less than 400 words, the shortest story in the first edition. In hindsight, only says, quote, what I heard was hard to believe, but I wanted to believe it. What's more, I wanted to try it and see if it wouldn't work for me. It worked and is still working. It's like, yeah, what's the story there? You know, Myron, what's going on? So again, not one single report of anything even remotely resembling a six-step program being practiced in New York during the Flying Pride period. Now, clearly people were staying sober in the late 1930s, but how? Although Dr. Bob makes no mention of it in his big book story, which is almost all drunk log, Bill shows up, told me a couple of things, and I haven't had a drink since. It's like, okay, Bob, thanks. That doesn't really help me get sober. Like, what am I supposed to do here? Call Bill Wilson up? We know that he made amends on his first day sober, and that he even did the equivalent of a fifth step with Bill Wilson shortly after that. Bill tells that story wonderfully at one of the founders' meetings out in Akron. But both of those were pretty standard Oxford group practices. What those 30 big book stories do all seem to agree on are three basic actions that must be taken if you truly want to get sober. You need to admit you're licked, powerless. You need to surrender your life to God, and you need to be helpful and useful to others. And those three steps to recovery that are mentioned over and over and over again in those 30 stories perfectly agree with the message of recovery that Bill had detailed in the chapters that he had already written for the big book. Remember, he hasn't written the steps or 5 and 6 yet. This is before he wrote the 12 steps. They line up perfectly with that. Admit you're licked is exactly what he's talking about, and there is a solution, and then much more detail and more about alcoholism. And surrender your life to God gets mentioned, and there is a solution, and in much more detail in We Agnostics. And be useful and helpful to others is what working with others is all about. But quite obviously, the key elements to those three was the absolute necessity of surrendering to God. I mean, we just heard that over and over and over again. And I think there's no better example of this than Clarence Snyder's story of his surrender to Jesus in February of 1938. in Akron. Clarence did his surrender with Dr. Bob in the hospital. They both got down on their knees. Clarence said, I don't know how to pray. Bob said, get down on your knees here with me. And Bob coached him by saying, Jesus, this is Clarence Schneider. He's a drunk. Clarence, this is Jesus. Ask him to come into your life. Ask him to remove your drinking problem and pray that he manage your life because you are unable to manage it yourself. And then as Clarence went to his first AA meeting in Akron, when he got out of the hospital, he's handed a piece of paper by one of the men in that particular meeting down at T. Henry Williams' house, and it was from Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. It said, therefore, if any be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. And Clarence said he broke down crying when he read that. A message of hope, no doubt about it. And this sort of explicit Christian religiosity was not just confined to Ohio. In February of 1937, this is a year before Clarence gets sober, but it's just months before the New York group broke with the Oxford group. Bill Rudell was released from Towns Hospital and he was advised to contact Bill Wilson. And he and his wife, Kathleen, visited Bill and Lois in their home. And after some heartfelt discussion, they were invited to go upstairs where, according to Bill, quote, Kathleen and I knelt down in front of the fireplace in your upstairs parlor with both you and Lois, and I made my surrender. Clearly, what was going on in early AA was very much along the simple lines of this simple three-step program. Admit your lick, surrender your life to God, and be helpful and useful to others. Not the carefully crafted six-step program that Bill later claimed it to be. Now, whenever I make this claim, there's always somebody who objects, saying, I haven't forgotten all about page 263 in the big book, which explicitly claims that there was a six-step program in Akron long before the 12 steps were written. Believe me, somebody always objects. In his big book story, He Sold Himself Short, Earl Treat says Dr. Bob took him through, quote, six-step program as it was at that time. And he supposedly did it in 3 or 4 hours in April of 1937. Earl claimed that those, quote, 6 steps were 1, complete deflation, 2, dependence and guidance from a higher power, 3, moral inventory, 4, confession, 5, restitution, and 6, continue to work with alcoholics, end quote. Now, there are several obvious elements of standard Oxford group practices to be found in at least 4 of Earl's quote unquote 6 steps. 2 of the 4, there are 4 basic spiritual practices of the Oxford group, and 2 of those 4, surrender, the equivalent of Earl's number 2, and restitution, Earl's number 5, that takes care of those 2. And 2 of the 5 C's, the Oxford group had this 5C program as their own Christian program of recovery are confession, Earl's step number 4, and continuance, Earl's step number 6. So the point is that Earl's story does nothing more than confirm that the early Akron members were deeply embedded in the Oxford group and slavishly following the spiritual program being offered to them there, most especially in Akron. Besides this strong connection to the Oxford group, rather than to any early 6-step program of recovery, the fact of the matter is that Earl's big book story was written 18 years after he supposedly went through this 6-step program, and it wasn't published for the first time in 1955. It was published for the first time in 1955 in the 2nd edition of the big book. Earl had refused to write a story for the first version. In short, claiming that the Akron, quote, as he said, 6-step program as it was at the time in Akron was identical to the 6-step program that Bill later talked about, is just one more case of modifying the past to fit the present reality. False memory again. So how much credibility can we actually give to this written long after the fact story that Earl's steps were the same as the 6 steps that Bill Wilson started talking about in 1949? I would have to say none. On one side, there's this one single story written 18 years after the fact and at least 5 years after Bill Wilson started spreading his 6-step story far and wide in AA. And on the other side, there's a veritable mountain of contemporary evidence that makes this absolutely no mention of a 6-step program in early AA. Let's face it, to claim that Earl's story proves that they were actually getting sober on Bill Wilson's 6-step program in early AA, you would have to believe a bunch of things. You'd have to believe that Dr. Bob got sober doing Ebby's 6 steps, which Bill gotten him from Ebby in November of 34, but somehow just forgot to mention it in his big book story. And Hank Parkhurst also got sober on 6 steps, but didn't say anything about it in his big book story. And Joe Doppler forgot about being saved by a six-step program in his big book story. And Florence Rankage, she failed to mention those six steps in her story, along with Bill Rudell, Harry Brick, Jim Scott, Walter Bray, Clarence Schneider, Ernie Galbraith, and Tom Lucas. And also, Bill Horn, he got sober using those six steps, but he didn't remember to mention them in his big step story. And Charlie Simmons also forgot, as did Del Tryon and Bob Oviatt and Wally Gillum and Archie Trowbridge and Paul Stanley and Harold Sears. And oh yeah, you also would have to allege, if Earl treats to be credibly believed here, that Norm Hunt got sober using those six steps, but didn't think it was important enough to mention in his big book story. And Harry Zoller didn't think it was important enough either. Nor did Ray Furlong or Dick Stanley or Myron Williams or Horace Mayer or Ray Campbell or Lloyd Tate. Well, so do you really think it's possible that all those writers just forgot to mention it was Bill's fairly concise six-step program that they followed to be relieved of their alcoholism? We all have to decide what we're going to weigh, how we're going to weigh the available evidence. And, I have wonderful arguments and discussions with the other AA historians that weigh things differently than I do. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful. I love that stuff. We all have to decide for ourselves. But I personally think Earl's much later single claim is absolutely overwhelmed by a huge amount of negative evidence against it. We weren't doing Bill Wilson's six steps in Akron, Ohio in April of 1937. That's about what it looks like, folks. So I'm siding with the great AA historian Ernie Kurtz, who noted that the formulation, this is a quote from one of his footnotes, the formulation of these six steps was contrived by Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson made them up. And with the highly respected AA historian Glenn Chestnut, who's unfortunately no longer with us, who wrote, there is no evidence that there was any formal set of six steps being listed and followed by people in AA prior to Bill Wilson writing of the 12 steps in early December of 1938. Thank you, Glenn. Glenn also said people who like things neat and tidy with lists to memorize tend to get carried away with this idea of six steps. No kidding, folks. And start imagining early AA meetings with a window shade mounted on the wall displaying the list of the six steps and everybody sitting around memorizing and analyzing the six steps. No six steps, according to Glenn Chestnut, either. Given all of that evidence that no one in early AA even mentions getting sober by following a six-step program, I believe we can confidently agree with Ernie Kurtz that the story was something contrived by Bill Wilson. We'll get to the question why a little bit later. Which leaves us with a third major problem in Bill Wilson's version of where the steps came from and how they were written. If Bill didn't get the 12 steps from the fictitious, okay, I'm going to buy it. They are fictitious. The fictitious six steps, where did they come from? I believe they came from Bill's own experience in getting sober rather than from the collective experience of the group. There are two fairly substantial reasons for believing this. Well aware of his own tendency towards grandiosity, Wilson repeatedly denied himself credit for things that he was solely responsible for. He did this over and over. Boy, you stumble across this over and over and over as you go through the archives. But he generally gave that credit to other people. Once again, this is a perfect example of this is the ever-growing list of co-founders that Bill created over the years. Oh, Dr. Bob Smith's a co-founder, Ann Smith's a co-founder, and Dr. Silkwood, he was a co-founder, and Sister Ignatia was definitely a co-founder, and Sam Shoemaker was a co-founder, and William James was a co-founder, for God's sakes. That's just six of them, Now, all of those people did make substantial contributions to AA. I'm not saying they didn't make substantial contributions to AA. Of course they made substantial contributions to AA. But the truth of the matter is Bill Wilson is the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was lending credit to people where they really didn't deserve it, and he was trying to offload it so that people would think less of him as a god. I mean, can you imagine being in a meeting and having Bill Wilson walk in the meeting? Oh my goodness, Bill Wilson. Just think about that, folks. The guy that saved my life. The other reason he started telling that story was because claiming that this is what we did. This is what we did. We did these six steps. And then I broke them down and then this is what we did, is so much more convincing and persuasive than saying this is what I did. Contemporary primary documents confirm the fact that the 12 steps grew directly out of Bill Wilson's own experience in getting sober, and we have two unimpeachable sources in support of this claim. The first date's from January 30th, 1948. Now that's 16 months before Bill told his first six-step story. Bill and Lois are on a train going to Washington, D.C. for a AA regional banquet. And with him on the train is a lawyer named Paul Hennessy, and who I think is his secretary, or another lawyer, Eileen Barrett. Paul's going to be giving a speech at the banquet. He's a big deal. Paul's a big deal guy. He's honoring Fitz Mayo. He's going to give the keynote speech on Fitz Mayo as the founder of the Washington AA group. And they're on the train. Paul tells Bill that he has never heard the story of the evolution of the 12 steps. And he asks for some details. Now think about that. Here's a guy who's sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, and he's never heard the story, although it's now 9 years after the fact, on how the 12 steps were written. Paul thought Bill's story that he told him on the train was so important and impressive that he, quote, was of sufficient importance to commit to writing. And several months after the January train ride, Paul put it in writing, and wrote it and sent it to Bill. And he said to Bill, quote, as soon as we reached Washington on that trip last January, I dictated my version of Bill's story to Eileen Barrett, who agreed with my version as outlined. This memorandum, this is a memorandum that he's sending to Bill Wilson that's in the archive in GSO in New York. This memorandum has been compiled from the original draft, which is now before me, and also from a subsequent conversation with Bill. Paul's noting that his subsequent conversation with Bill, and in this letter, his written request to Bill countersign and return a copy of the memorandum as being true, attest to the fact that Wilson confirmed and endorsed this version of the story of how the 12 steps came to be written. In that approved memorandum that you can find in the archive, Paul says Bill Wilson explained. This is what Bill Wilson told him where the 12 steps came. He explained how the pioneers in AA fought, thought, and prayed their way through to recovery. And then Bill noted that in those days, quote, the alcoholics were obliged, 1, to admit he was powerless over alcohol. 2, to make an inventory of his own character. 3, put trust in God. 4, to work with other alcoholics. When asked in 1948, Bill Wilson delivers a 4-step program. Back to Paul's letter. Quote, as it stood, this program, according to Bill, needed clarification. Bill says, Bill sat down and began to figure out the various phases of his own recovery. Setting them down on paper, he found that there were 12 separate and distinct steps. And now it's a story that Bill Wilson countersigned and approved as being true in February and in late 1948, 7 months before he told this 6-step story to those psychiatrists in Montreal for the first time. So now some might object that relying too heavily on this, again, one of these 10-year after fact pieces of evidence to prove that Bill Wilson wrote the 12 steps based solely on his own experience. But we also have a much earlier and a much more credible evidence to confirm that story. As we've seen, there is no evidence in the contemporary documents, including those 30 stories written for the first edition of the Big Book, of there being an early 6-step or even a 12-step program of recovery from alcoholism. But absolute confirmation that the steps were a summation of the various phases, as he said in that thing, of Bill's own recovery, can be found in the 2 versions of Bill's story written in late May of 1938. A full 6 months before the 12 steps were supposedly first written down on paper. In late May of 1938, Bill Wilson first wrote a very long and then a much shorter version of his story. In them, he explicitly mentions, we couldn't find anything in those other 30 stories. In his story, he explicitly mentions 11 of the 12 steps. Missing only is the 2nd step, which we're going to hear about a little bit later. In the first written, the very long version of his story, he's having a little trouble getting control of his material. He's trying to write 5,000-word chapters. It's 12,000 words long, and it's often called the original story. It's a wonderful read. Bill plainly mentions 8 of the 12 steps. And in the shorter version that followed, 5,300 words, he neatly paraphrases 12 of the steps. I'm sorry, 10 of the 12 steps. I'm misreading my own PowerPoint here. So again, I don't mean to bore you, but here's a comparison of the 12 steps as they were first formally published in April of 1939 with the 12 steps that can be found in those 2 earliest versions of Bill's story. On the left-hand side is going to be April, this is the big book got published, April 1939. On the right-hand side is May of 1938, and we got the original story of May of 1938 and Bill's story of 1938. Now, the first step, like myself, he had admitted defeat, is probably the least articulate paraphrase of the step that we've got for what follows. But what follows here is like fasten your seatbelt, folks, because it's unbelievable how articulate Bill is about the rest of these steps as we go forward. The third step, in the original story, he said, turn my face to God as I understand him and place my life at his disposal and direction. And in Bill's story, he said, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Step 3, people. Step 4, original story. Take a thorough and ruthless inventory of my moral defects and derelictions. And Bill's story, I ruthlessly faced my sins of omission and commission, made a list of people towards whom I felt resentments. Step 5, I should sit down with whatever person I chose and reveal to him without any reservation whatever the results of my self-appraisal, and to be really honest with myself and God. The original story. Bill's story, I fully acquainted him, Abby, with my problems and deficiencies. Step 6, original story. I was now willing to rid myself of all these defects. Moreover, I was to understand that this would not be accomplished by myself alone. Therefore, original story, I was to humbly ask God that he take these handicaps away. And in Bill's story, for 7, it says, became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch. Step 8, original story, made a list of all the people I had hurt or with whom I had bad relations. And in Bill's story, it said, we made a list of people I had hurt or towards whom I had resentments. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. Man, that's just more words that are in that step, and just boiled it down to that 8. Step 9, approach these people, telling them I had come to set matters right insofar as I possibly could, but discretion should be used lest others should be hurt. And in Bill's story, I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Step 10, out of Bill's original story, the principle of making amends was to continue into the future. When I was wrong, promptly admitted it. Into the future. Step 11, Bill's story. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. And step 12, all out of Bill's story. 3 parts to step 12. By the way, in the original, I've got it underlined on the left-hand side. It didn't say spiritual awakening, it says spiritual experience, but I just always have to point that out. So here's Bill's story, the 3 things. The moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. Number 2, I soon found out that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. And number 3, my friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of my demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. In short, although it has always been claimed that the 12 steps were first written in early December 1934, this is just concrete evidence that Bill had clearly written 11 of them out as his various phases of recovery in his story a full 6 months before December 1938. Ever the pragmatist, Bill Wilson was the #1 William James pragmatist, believe me, folks. Bill Wilson saw that if he wanted to create something so specific that the suffering alcoholic could not wiggle out of it, then his own experience was the best way to describe the suggested program of recovery they should follow to get sober. And I think it's important to note that in those first 2 early versions of Bill's story, they made no mention of the second step, but between the February printing of the multilith copy and the April publication of the big book, Hank Parkhurst, we got it in Hank Parkhurst's handwriting. Hank Parkhurst added 4 amazing paragraphs to Bill's story, which cover the second step. So these 4 paragraphs did not appear in the multilith copy. They only appeared in the April publication. And these are the 4 paragraphs. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, Why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. Thank you, thank you, thank you 100 times over, Hank Parkers, for those 4 paragraphs. And that brings the total number of steps to be found in Bill's story up to 12. This is a copy of my big book. There they are. Pages 12 and number one's on page 11. There's 12 and 13 right there. Bang, 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 bang. So if it's true, as we've seen, that the 6 steps did not break down into 12 steps, and there is no contemporary mention of a 6-step program in early AA, and the 12 steps are really just a recounting of Bill Wilson's own experience for getting sober, then there's a fourth major problem. That needs to be explained, and that is, why did Bill Wilson start telling this bogus 6-step story in May of 1949? Well, what was that all about? It's certainly an interesting question, but there's no documentary evidence to help me explain this. So in an attempt to answer that question, the best I can do is leave behind this world that we've been living in of solid, contemporary, primary document sources found in the contemporary documents, and I can offer you my best guess speculation. So we're going into the speculation realm here, folks. I don't know what that, yeah, here we go. A diligent search in all of Bill's 1940 speeches and grapevine articles finds absolutely no evidence of him ever, that he ever told the public origin of the 12-step story before May 24th, 1949. Can't find one. I wish I could find one. I wish there would be one, but I can't find one. Given all of his other 1940 stories and writings about things that happened during AA's early history, the fact that he never once talked about the creation of the 12 steps falls somewhere between what I think of as surprising and shocking. I can't believe that. Again, what's more important and central to Alcoholics Anonymous than the 12 steps? No mention. I would speculate. I would speculate that the reasons for this silence can be found in some of the evidence already presented here. The 12 steps weren't these steps that we took, as it says so explicitly in the big book. They were the steps that Bill took. We is so much more convincing and persuasive. So you want to move off of that. These were my steps to these are everybody's steps. I would also speculate that the reason Bill avoided telling any origin of the 12-step story was because to truthfully do so would reveal that they were primarily based on just one man's experience in getting sober, his own experience, rather than the collective experience, as it said in the big book of, quote, 100 men and women, end quote. Given the fact that Bill Wilson admitted to Paul Hennessy in January of 1948 that the steps were based on his own experience, and the fact that Paul Hennessy then put those facts in writing with Bill's written approval in October of 1948, I further speculate that after this single unguarded moment of uncandor on the train where he showed all his cards, Bill Wilson began to worry that it might become public knowledge that he had admitted his own experience was the real source and basis of the 12 steps. I'm trying to figure out why he started telling the story here, folks. And I think he was worried. To have that information spread more widely would raise serious doubts about the 10-year-old foundation story of AA's Alcoholics. They've been telling this story for 10 years. You know, this is what we all did. That the steps were a collective presentation of everyone's experience in getting sober, potentially derailing the ongoing success of AA's program of recovery. If you destroyed that 10-year-old foundational story that it was everybody. And so, to protect AA, I really think Wilson was trying to protect AA from the possible disastrous consequences that story gets spread widely around. I do believe that 7 months later, Bill rolled out this new AA myth about there being an original and gradually evolving 6-step program. Took the heat right off him. A tall tale of a 6-step program that those early AAs supposedly followed before the 12 steps were published in April of 1938, rather than following this Oxford group practice program that they were actually doing. And that he then took those 6 steps and broke them down into the more specific and detailed 12 steps on that fateful day in December of 1938. Bill Wilson most certainly wanted to distance AA from its almost complete dependence on those Oxford group practices throughout its formative years. He wanted to ensure that AA's 12 steps were recognized not as some Oxford group thing, but as a unique AA solution for alcoholism. And to do that, he needed to create an absolutely new backstory, one that claimed those more detailed 12 steps had simply grown out of an already pre-existing six-step program, rather than having grown solely out of the Oxford group practices and the other common spiritual practices that they had experimented with during the flying blind period. In short, the six-step story firmly established AA as a standalone, original, and widely successful solution to alcoholism. Note well that these last few slides are pure speculation. Although that speculation does, in my opinion, fit very neatly with all of the other data that we know for sure to be true. Somebody else could weave a different story. I'm okay with that. In conclusion, let me be perfectly clear here. Saying that Bill Wilson invented the six-step story in May of 1949, a full 10 and a half years after he wrote the 12 steps, I don't want to be criticizing or denigrating this man in any way whatsoever. That's not what we're talking about here, folks. We need to accept and embrace the fact that Bill wasn't even trying to be an accurate historian. Instead, he was a great storyteller whose stories had just one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to get people sober. And those stories of his, and they get called parables, you can call them myths, you can call them metaphors, you can call them yarns. He calls them, I'm going to tell you a yarn. Bill Wilson said that in a couple of his talks, or tall tales or whatever you want to call them, have been tremendously successful in doing exactly that. As can be getting people sober, as can be seen by the gratitude felt by over 2 million alcoholics walking the face of this earth today, sober people. And those people got sober on Bill Wilson's life-saving 12 steps. Bill was a man of vision, a grand, uplifting, universal, deeply spiritual, and life-saving vision. He was a man who told stories that were meant to sell his vision of recovery to the still suffering alcoholic, and we can hardly fault him if the historical record, as found in those thousands and thousands of primary documents preserved at archives across the Northeast, contradict him as often as it does. So to claim that Bill Wilson invented the six-step story, rather than admit the 12 steps basically reflected his own experience in getting sober, is very much to his credit. By doing so, he effectively took the spotlight off himself. This wasn't a program based on one man's success, but rather on the success of a whole group of people, the new story, while simultaneously making the claims of how it worked just that much more credible. This is what we did. As he created a detailed and concrete program of recovery that those sneaky alcoholics just could not wiggle out of. And hence we get Bill Wilson telling the mythical origin stories of both the 6 steps and the 12 steps. Thank you, Bill. And thank you all for listening.